Slide title. The webinar will begin shortly. Icons for questions and comments, closed captioning, Zoom technical support, feedback, Twitter, LinkedIn.
Thank you everyone for joining today. This webinar will begin shortly. We're just going to allow a few moments here to have other people join us on this webinar. We wanted to go over a few housekeeping items in the interim. First, we want this to be interactive and educational, and so we will be having a dedicated Q&A period at the end of our presentation. However, we welcome you to share your questions and comments in the chat window. You can also send us questions in the Q&A section, and you can see a Q&A feature as part of this webinar platform. We are offering closed captioning as well as Zoom technical support if you need it. You can also chat us if you need help. We want this to be something we learn from, and so we ask that you please also share your feedback with us. We are chatting out the URL so you can access that feedback form. If you would take a few seconds to fill that out either during the middle or end of this session. We also want to welcome you to join our community. This is just an initial engagement, but we want to stay connected to you long term. So we welcome you to follow us on Twitter. We also welcome you to join us on LinkedIn.
Title: Pre-application webinar. Developing financial and legal planning platforms for AD/ADRD caregivers.
With that, we are delighted to welcome you to our pre-application webinar, Developing Financial and Legal Planning Platforms for AD/ADRD caregivers.
Agenda.
Today, we will be doing an overview of the National Institute on Aging, SBIR and STTR programs. We'll be hearing from the Administration for Community Living, as well as getting into some of the details about our solicitation. And then we'll have a moderated Q&A with all of our esteemed panelists. Again, please use the Q&A function on your viewer.
Featured speakers.
I'd like to introduce our featured speakers today. We have Dr. Todd Haim. He's from the Office of Small Business Research at the National Institute on Aging. You'll hear us use the acronym NIA. We also welcome Vijeth Iyengar, and he is the Brain Health and Lead and Technical Advisor at the Administration for Community Living. Welcome. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Dana Plude, Deputy Director at the Division of Behavioral and Social Research at the National Institute on Aging as well. And I'm your moderator, Monique Laroque. With that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Haim from NIA.
About the National Institute on Aging.
Thank you very much, Monique, and thank you to the other panelists. I think you'll find a very informative panel, for anyone that is thinking about this RFA, an RFA that we're really excited about. So next slide.
NIA Office of Small Business Research, core activities.
I'm going to start by giving an overview of how the SBIR program works, how we're structured at the NIA in terms of the small business programs, eligibility, things of that nature. And then I will turn it over to both Vijeth Iyengar and Dana Plude, who will speak more about the scientific goals of both the ACL and the NIA, as well as the specifics of what we're looking for in this FOA. So just to orient you, I am at the National Institute of Aging. On Aging. I manage the Office of Small Business Research, where we have really 6 core functions. We essentially coordinate the program across the Institute. We provide guidance to applicants. So and I'll talk more about that, as you're applying, we're an initial point of contact for you. We do outreach, just as this webinar is showing. We develop funding opportunities, as we did here. We're involved in helping our innovators network with the people that they'll need to network with to commercialize their products, and also to network with stakeholders. And then we're also involved in helping implement entrepreneurship training for those that would benefit from it. Next slide.
About SBIR and STTR, congressionally mandated programs.
So the Small Business Innovation Research and the Small Business Technology Transfer Program, SBIR and STTR, they're both congressionally mandated programs. This RFA is specific to the SBIR program, which is the larger of the two. 3.2% of federal agencies that provide extramural funding that 3.2% of that extramural funding must go to small businesses using the SBIR program. Next slide.
NIH SBIR STTR Programs.
So again, this one's specific on SBIR, but this shows you the two programs. STTR is very similar, but there is a requirement for an academic partner with it, whereas with SBIR, it is often the case, but not required. And total, these programs result in about $1.2 billion a year. At the NIA, it's estimated to be about $120 million this year. Next slide.
Why seek SBIR STTR funding?
So that's $120 million going to small business using SBIR grants and mainly grants at the NIA and to STTR. Those grants are seed funding, so it's not like a private investor. It's not a loan. There's no repayment. There's no impact on stocks or shares. It really is grant funding to the startup of small business. The small business retains all the intellectual property rights. The funding not only provides the capital needed to get you to that key inflection point, but also provides recognition, verification, and visibility. Next slide.
Eligibility.
So in order to be eligible, you essentially have to meet the United States Small Business Administration's definition of a U.S. small business. So you must be organized for profit in the U.S., be under 500 employees, be owned and operated by U.S. individuals, majority, meaning over 50%, or be owned and operated majority by venture capital operating firms in the U.S., as long as no single firm owns greater than 50%. Next slide.
We strategically fund innovations for.
So at the NIA, we strategically fund innovations for a variety of age-related diseases, challenges, and opportunities. Alzheimer's disease and AD-related dementias are a key priority area for the Institute. We are the lead federal agency for Alzheimer's disease. But we're also very interested in helping support the development and implementation of technologies that enable aging in place, that enhance healthy aging, that address age-related diseases and conditions, and the development of research tools and care management technologies that is so critical. And on the right, you see the pie chart that shows, a current estimation of the types of technological modalities that we are funding.
32% treatments, 5% imaging devices, 7% in vitro diagnostics, 9% research tools, 19% digital and mobile health, 10% supportive devices, 18% sensors and monitoring technologies.
Next slide.
SBIR and STTR program phases and funding levels.
So the SBIR program is structured in phases per Congress, no correlation to clinical trial nomenclature. For when applicable, the majority of our projects are in fact preclinical. A phase 1 SBIR is usually up to 1 year, generally can be up to $300,000 total cost, and establish technical merit, feasibility, and potential commercialization. Whereas a phase 2 is usually up to $2 million total cost, usually 2 years in length, and it requires a commercialization plan. So it's a little later stage, and there's more that we ask for up front. A fast track is a way to combine a phase 1 application and a phase 2 application in one. And this is important because for this RFA, we chose to limit it to fast tracks and direct to phase 2s because we were looking for technologies that are closer to commercialization and, technologies that we thought would be appropriate for these two mechanisms. So if you are really, relatively early stage, maybe you have, ideas and you think you could put those ideas together into a fast track, that could work. If you already have a prototype and now you want to kind of do that validation study of the prototype, that's where you can actually skip the phase 1 altogether and come in for the direct to phase 2. And then once you're funded with a phase 2, whether it be through a fast track or direct to phase 2, there are later stage funding opportunities such as the commercialization readiness pilot and the phase 2B, which are each about $3 million in total costs. Next slide.
Budget specifics.
So in terms of submitting your application and what has to go into that budget, the limits are total cost. There are restrictions as to how much can be subcontracted. In your application, you can request, and we do actually encourage you to request a 7% fee. There is a fee section. That is called the company profit, but it's really the only funding you can get from the NIH where we don't ask you any questions about how you're spending it. And you'll find, as a business, that money becomes very important for things like legal fees or, management fees or things that aren't typically supported by NIH. And then it's important to note that you can also include fee-for-service type activities as part of the company cost. Next slide.
NIA funding opportunities.
So we have several funding opportunities in addition to the one we're discussing today. So if you don't fit the one we're discussing today, you may fit either the omnibus, which is investigator initiated. It's across the NIH, and the NIA, of course, participates. And that's really anything addressing aging will come to the NIA through the omnibus. The other solicitation to mention is PS 19-316 and 317, which is, I like to call it the omnibus for Alzheimer's disease. It's really a open-ended solicitation to address Alzheimer's disease from every angle, whether it be therapeutics, prevention, behavioral health technologies, sensors, anything that would address the prevention, treatment, diagnosis, or care of Alzheimer's disease and research. Next slide.
NIA funding opportunities continued.
I mentioned the commercialization readiness pilot as a later stage initiative. Also to note, there is the diversity supplement once you're funded by the NIH. And there's another funding opportunity if you're looking to look at NIH developed technologies. An interesting funding opportunity is that SBIR tech transfer funding opportunity. Next slide.
NIH resources to help research entrepreneurs complemented by NIA efforts.
So at the NIA, we also have resources to help you, whether it be to help you apply, to help you once you're funded. For those that have not been funded before by the NIH, you can definitely consider the Applicant Assistance Program, which is run leading up to each application due date, each general application due date. So there will be a call launched shortly for the January 5th due date, which is the next due date for the omnibus and that AD solicitation. We also, in your application, you can include budget for technical assistance. I mentioned the diversity supplement. There are a variety of entrepreneurial training programs such as C3I and ICOR. And the NIH has also launched the Small Business Entrepreneurial Education Development Office, they call SEED, which has access to a variety of instrumental resources like entrepreneurs in residence, regulatory specialists, reimbursement specialists, etc. Next slide.
Want guidance? Send us the AIMS page.
So I mentioned that, we are here to help you in your application, and that the same is true for this RFA. So if you are planning on applying, you are welcome to send us at least a month before the due date a specific AIMS page. And the way I recommend you think about that page is that the first half to 2/3 of the page really tell the reviewers and the program staff, out of all the applications that the NIH gets, why is this the one they should be most excited about? And that includes a mention of, what is a technology prototype to be developed? What is the innovation in that prototype, the unmet need being addressed, and the technical challenges, the value proposition, the competitive advantage, textual highlights of any preliminary data that you would include in the rest of the solicitation, and the relevance of the R&D to NIA's mission. And then the last third to half a page will be the specific aims for the proposed project. So going back to a point I mentioned before, in terms of a fast track versus direct to phase 2, The preliminary data is one distinguishing point. So if you already have preliminary data, then the direct to phase 2 is applicable. But if you don't have any preliminary data, then you will need to go the fast track route, because in order to be eligible for direct to phase 2, you have to essentially show that you've done proof of concept type work, which would have been equivalent to a phase 1 using other funds. So in that case, in the direct to phase 2, there is a requirement to have that preliminary data, but there is not that requirement for a fast track. Next slide.
About the administration for community living.
So I'd now like to introduce Vijeth Iyengar, who will speak about the administration for community living. And we really worked in collaboration together to develop this funding opportunity that is a great opportunity addressing both of our needs and goals, the ACL and the NIA. So Vijeth, take it away.
Thanks very much, Todd, for the handoff and for providing an overview of the SBIR STTR program and this RFA. My name is Vijeth Iyengar. I'm the Brain Health Lead and Technical Advisor at the U.S. Administration for Community Living, or ACL, an operating division of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. As Todd mentioned, ACL is a proud partner and collaborator with the National Institute on Aging for this RFA and this program. With the time I have with you all today, I'll provide a brief introduction to the core mission, services, and activities of ACL, in addition to providing a brief overview of the science and empirical findings undergirding this program. Next slide, please.
About ACL.
The Administration for Community Living, or ACL, brings together the efforts and achievements of the Administration on Aging, AOA, the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, AIDD, and the HHS Office on Disability to serve as the federal agency responsible for increasing access to community supports, while focusing attention and resources on the unique needs of older Americans and people with disabilities across the lifespan. Next slide, please.
Who do we serve?
Services, programs, and activities delivered by ACL touch some of the most medically vulnerable segments of our population, including those individuals who are below 150% of the poverty line, those individuals that are frail and vulnerable, or those individuals at risk for emergency room visits and hospitalization, or at risk for nursing home admission. ACL works closely with the aging network of providers to reach these individuals. Next slide, please.
The Older Americans Act. A pyramid diagram starts with AOA on top with arrows pointing down to 56 state units and 270 tribal organizations, 618 area agencies on aging, more than 20,000 service providers and hundreds of thousands of volunteers, and the final largest portion of the pyramid, provides services and supports to nearly 1 in 5 seniors. This section is divided into 7 segments. 358 million meals, 24 million rides, 42 million hours of personal care, homemaker and chore services, 3.6 million hours of case management, 716,000 caregivers assisted, 6.3 million hours of respite care, over 398,000 ombudsman consultations.
Specifically, via the Older Americans Act and through the Administration on Aging, a unit housed within ACL, the agency has helped nearly 11 million older adults remain at home through low-cost, community-based services through its strong bi-directional relationships with state units on aging, tribal organizations, and area agencies on aging, or AAAs, which are public or private nonprofit agencies designated by a state to address the needs and concerns of all older persons at the regional and local levels. Providing services and supports to our nation's older adults is increasingly critical as this segment of the population continues to grow in numbers. In the next few slides, I'll provide both a demographic and empirical basis for the importance of this new program from NIA and ACL. Next slide, please.
We live in an increasingly aging society. A world map, proportion of population aged 60 years or older, by country, 2015. Percentage aged 60 years or older. Only Japan is at 30 or more, much of Europe is 25 to 29. The rest of the map is 24 or lower.
Demographic data from the World Health Organization, United Nations, the US Census, and other organizations highlight the global increase in numbers of individuals aged 60 years or older in the coming decades. This becomes clear when looking at comparisons of, say, 2015, as depicted on this slide, and population projections in 2050 as found on the subsequent slide. Next slide, please.
And this will compound in the coming decades. The same map with 2050 projections. The majority of this map is 25 or higher, with also large sections in the middle ranges and only parts of Africa in the 0 to 9 range.
As is abundantly clear from this slide of population projections in the year 2050, in the coming decades, there will be significant shifts in demography. Next slide, please.
Diving a bit deeper into these trends.
Closer to home, if we take a look at recent projections and estimates, there's expected to be a rise in the number of older adults aged 65 and over in the US over the next several decades. This pattern that we expect in the US largely mirrors that of population projections for the world. So for example, those in the 65 to 84-year-old age range are thought to grow in numbers in China, India, and Indonesia, for example. In short, our populations are getting older, and as a result, it is incumbent to meet the needs of this growing population. Next slide, please.
The number of unpaid caregivers is growing, and so is their economic value.
Paralleling these demographic trends in the number of older adults is a rise in the number of individuals requiring care, and in turn, the number of family caregivers. Data from AARP, the National Alliance for Caregiving, and other organizations underscore this accompanying trend, with data from a 2015 report highlighting the increasing economic value of caregivers that will continue to increase in the years to come, with the number of older adults increasing in the decades to come as well. Next slide, please.
Demands on caregivers are both diverse and challenging.
Driving this hidden economic value of unpaid family caregivers is the panoply of responsibilities, demands, and challenges faced by family caregivers in the course of the provision of care. Available survey data from 2017 of family caregivers highlights that a vast majority of family caregivers provide emotional and social support, enact financial caregiving duties, and provide household support, while simultaneously facing challenges in the provision of support, including tolls on their own mental health, emotional well-being, and overall personal health. As highlighted from the survey data on this slide, financial caregiving is a responsibility undertaken by many family caregivers. On the next few slides, we dive a bit deeper as to the forms of financial caregiving that's provided in data that's available from another survey. Next slide, please.
Financial caregiving tasks undertaken on a daily basis.
When examining the types of financial management tasks executed by a family caregiver for a friend and or relative, as identified by another survey on the slide, categories of financial caregiving that emerge include paying bills, reviewing statements, and other duties, including navigating the insurance and foreign exchange markets. As you can see, there's a diversity in the everyday financial tasks that a family caregiver undertakes on a daily basis. Next slide, please.
Tasks that are more infrequent.
Other categories of financial management tasks are executed, but on a more infrequent basis, include advice on issues surrounding savings, investment, and retirement, and document management, including the management of legal documentation. What's clear from survey data is that family caregivers undertake many different types of tasks that touch upon financial and legal management and planning, both on a frequent and infrequent basis. Relevant to today's RFA program, previous slide, please. Relevant to this program and to the call for action is a role of technology in supporting caregivers as they undertake these duties. Next slide, please.
Is there a role for technology to complement these efforts?
Available evidence from the AARP suggests that there's a real thirst among surveyed family caregivers in engaging in different types of technology in ways to help them manage finances and making legal decisions. From this survey from the AARP, over 60% and 70% of surveyed family caregivers expressed interest in technology for their legal and financial management responsibilities, respectively. The red arrows on this slide point to those areas mentioned before. The same report also identified several barriers to caregiver adoption to technology that's good to keep in mind while designing your own product or device or technology. This is included on the right-hand side of the slide, and barriers include sole use or absence of a one-stop shop platform, devices and technologies that are cost prohibitive, and thereby infrequently used, technologies that are increasingly complex, a real mismatch between solutions and identified needs of the family caregiver. Current tools are not often validated. Available tools lack cultural relevance or not personalized to the individual or to the user, and few solutions designed for use for low socioeconomic status communities. Hopefully, these set of slides gave you both an overview of ACL, the demographic imperative of why finding solutions for this growing population is important, and then some technology and family caregiving needs and trends to keep in mind. I'll now pass the baton to Dana, who will provide further information about the solicitation and the solutions we're looking for. Dana?
About NIA's Division of Behavioral and Social Research.
Thanks, I just appreciate that. So I get the easy job because my colleagues have set us up in terms of describing the small business program, giving you the background about the needs that the request for applications addresses, and telling you a bit about our different organizations. So I'm in the Division of Behavioral and Social Research at the National Institute on Aging. I will try to avoid using acronyms wherever I can, or at least I'll try to spell them out. So I'm at NIA, National Institute on Aging. The division that I'm in is one of 4 extramural divisions. The others are a Division of Neuroscience, Division of Geriatrics and Clinical Gerontology, and the Division of Aging and Biology. Each of those divisions has an interest in different aspects of aging. I hope from the label of my division, Behavioral and Social Research, you can understand that we have an interest in caregiving and caregiver research and supporting them. I saw a question in the chat asking about what's the relationship between ACL and NIA or NIH. We're both operating divisions of the Department of Health and Human Services. In this particular instance, ACL and NIA have a shared interest in the area of helping caregivers of persons with dementia specifically, but also more broadly, helping caregivers for all the reasons that I just went over.
BSR AD ADRD Research.
So my division supports research on a variety of topics related to Alzheimer's disease, but outside of Alzheimer's disease. Within the AD universe, the Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related research. We support all kinds of research having to do with dementia care, caregiver research, dementia epidemiology, so on and so forth. As an example of that interest, we just recently, last month, sponsored the second summit, the National Research Summit on Care Services and Supports for Persons with Dementia and Their Caregivers. As you would probably expect, this year it was a virtual summit. Last 3 years ago, it was in person. But the proceedings of the summit are archived and available online. You can access our website and follow links that get you to those recordings. There will be a document coming out of that meeting that outlines sort of areas of interest and areas targeting future research opportunities. It's that kind of an initiative that led to our working with ACL on developing this particular funding opportunity announcement. So earlier in the slide set, you heard us referring to funding opportunities or FOAs. Those are funding opportunity announcements. This particular one, next slide, please, is RFA. That's a request for applications. AG, standing for National Institute on Aging, 21-025. You can look that up online. And you'll see that, among other things, we're looking to support research and development and tools for the currently underdeveloped market that serves caregivers and their family members suffering from AD and AD-related disorders. In particular, we want to stimulate research and technology and tools that adapt to a range of levels of expertise and experience that are specific to the care demands of the targeted audience and that meet the needs of family caregivers who are under a tremendous burden in terms of not only oftentimes caring for their family member with dementia, but oftentimes it's somebody who's caring for their own family at the same time. So to stimulate, we want to stimulate research and development tools that integrate web and mobile educational applications into a common platform for family caregivers. We want to promote accessibility for individuals across the socioeconomic spectrum and with varying levels of technological sophistication. So in that funding opportunity announcement, we identified different areas that might be focused on by such platform, including power of attorney, medical advance directives, budgeting, Social Security, living arrangements, estate planning, care navigation, care coordination. Next slide, please.
Important dates of applicants.
It's important for you to keep in mind the deadlines for this opportunity. Another question that came up in chat asked whether this is a one-time solicitation or will it be reissued. Most requests for applications, which this is an RFA, is a one-time solicitation. So right now there's not a plan to reissue it in the future. So the due date for applications is November 12th. We ask if you are intending to submit an application, you submit a letter of intent. That would be due a month before that deadline of November 12th. That letter of intent ought to include the elements that Todd talked about earlier, the outline of the specific aims and such like that. But we'd also ask you to identify who the key members of the team are that are carrying out the research, because that helps us in terms of then setting up the review and making sure that we don't have conflicts of interest in the review panel. At the end of the funding opportunity announcement, you'll see that there is a person identified as a review contact. The review, like for most all small business applications submitted to the National Institutes of Health, the review is going to take place in the Center for Scientific Review, and Dr. Wei-Jini is identified as the point of contact currently for that review group that will convene sometime after, obviously, the applications come in, probably the early part of next year, February or so in 2021. If your application doesn't fit this particular solicitation, like Todd mentioned earlier, there are other opportunities, there are other funding opportunity announcements that you may be able to identify in which your project may fit. An example would be the omnibus date, the omnibus calls for applications, and the next due date for those is January 5, 2021. Next slide, please.
Features of successful solution.
So I'm thinking that if you tuned into this webinar, aside from learning some of the mechanics of how to apply, you're probably interested in what kinds of solutions are we actually looking for. And I just touched on some of these areas of interest in outlining the existing research. So we're thinking the successful solutions will be ones that are adaptable to the caregiver experience and their abilities. It ought to be cost-effective and scalable. It ought to be user-centered for individuals across the socioeconomic spectrum, and effective for people that are living in underrepresented, who are from underrepresented populations, sorry. It's perfectly fine for the solutions to be generalizable to non-dementia caregivers, but this specific call is really focused on dementia caregiving, and so that ought to be featured as part of your application development. And there should be an incorporation of machine learning or artificial intelligence in support of tailor-made content. The idea being that the solution ought to be adaptive to the learning of the individual who's using that system.
Connect with NIA. Icons for a website, nia.nih.gov/SBIR. Twitter at @NIA_SBIR. LinkedIn, NIA Office of Small Business Research. Links to view upcoming events and funding opportunities and a mailing list. Questions? Email niasmallbusiness@mail.nih.gov.
All right, so next slide, I think, brings us to the summary of how you can connect with us at NIA. And then we do the Twitter thing. We do the, I think there's also a link somewhere in here for LinkedIn. But these are some of the different ways that you can follow what's going on at the National Institute on Aging. And with that, I think we now move to questions, right? Thanks.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dana. And I also wanted to introduce on the line, we have Brian Bard. So for this funding opportunity, it will be managed by the National Institute on Aging. So any questions as far as application should go to the NIA. But if you are interested in ACL's other interests and their SBIR program, then Brian would be a great point of contact. And I'm not sure if Brian's enabled to speak. If you all, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
Great, thanks. So yeah, ACL does have its own small SBIR program located within an operating division or small agency known as the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. We are under ACL, sort of like ACL is under HHS. We are not part of the NIH in any way. And we're not part of the omnibus that is run, that you guys work with at the NIA, of course. We only hold one phase 1 application opportunity per year. It usually comes out sometime in December, and we hold one phase 2, and that funding opportunity announcement usually comes out sometime in the spring. We have a small budget. Our whole budget is about $3.2 million. We usually make about 10 phase 1 awards and about 4 to 5 phase 2 awards. It's completely field initiated, as long as it's designed to benefit the lives of people with disabilities and the elderly. We don't do fast tracking. We don't do direct to phase 2. And we run our own peer review process with a panel of reviewers that we hire. It fluctuates from year to year, but we don't operate in the same, we don't have standing panels like the NIH does with the omnibus. But we do, our phase 1s are $100,000 for up to 6 months. And our phase 2 are $575,000 for both of 2 years. And that's a real brief introduction to our SBIR program, and we can expect, again, phase 1 opportunities to come out sometime in December. Thanks very much, Todd.
Perfect, perfect. But yes, again, anyone that's applying for this specific funding opportunity, you know, both myself and Dana would be the perfect contact points, and then we can loop in Vijeth as well. So questions, Monique?
Yes, and thank you, Todd. I just wanted to let our participants know that we did send out a link via chat to the ACL SBIR program. We're focused on this particular opportunity, but they may be a really good resource for those who are interested in learning more, so please feel free to check them out. With that said, we have several questions that have come in, and thank you to some of the panelists who have gone ahead and started kicking us off on some of those responses as we were going through the presentation. I have a couple of questions about the requirements. This is coming in for Dana. Can you please describe in more detail the requirements or restrictions around including clinical studies versus other types of research covered by this grant opportunity?
Yes, sure, I can do that. So any project that involves an intervention that would be considered a clinical trial. So this would be an intervention to which people, there's some kind of, it's like the vaccine trials you hear about now, where there's going to be some kind of experimental group and then some kind of a control group. And participants are assigned randomly to one or the other. That would be considered a clinical trial. And there are certain steps that have to be taken in order to register such a study in clinicaltrials.gov, so that there can be registration and then follow-up of recruitment, and there are certain provisos that need to be met. I can't go into the details of all that now, but if you decide that you are going to submit such an application, that you don't want to come in under this particular request for applications, because as I'm looking at the funding opportunity announcement, it says clinical trial not allowed. So you really ought not to be doing a clinical trial kind of intervention in response to this particular call. We have other funding opportunity announcements where such would be allowed. In this case, though, the idea is to develop a technology that can be useful to people, and then to demonstrate its utility in meeting some of these criteria that we outline in the funding opportunity. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, it does. This next question is for Todd, and before I move forward with that, I want to encourage folks to please fill out the feedback form. We have chatted a link to that feedback form. Also, please join our community on LinkedIn and Twitter. And we are still taking questions, so we have tracked all the ones that have come in thus far. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature. It should be at the bottom of your screen. Todd, we have some folks who are newer to the SBIR and STTR program, and I wanted to see if you could please just reiterate the requirements, whether they're coming in through a particular phase or a fast track. And then if you could also spend a few minutes talking about the application assistance program for folks who have never applied to an NIH SBIR in the past?
Sure. So the a couple of things there. So thank you. That's a perfect slide.
SBIR and STTR program phases and funding levels.
So generally, let's say for the omnibus or that AD solicitation PS-19-316, you can come in as either a phase 1, a fast track, or direct to phase 2. A phase 1 would be, oftentimes you may not have any data. You really want to develop proof of concept. Now, to be competitive, it still helps to have data, preliminary data, but many times people don't. And they'll develop proof of concept through that phase 1 study, usually 6 months to a year in length. Then there is a fast track where you're taking what is that phase 1 and then that phase 2, which you can apply for once you finish the phase 1. And that 2-year more development focus usually includes some validation efforts. In the fast track, at the same time, you're submitting a phase 1 and phase 2 application. And you'd have essentially one page for the specific aims that would show both the phase 1 and the phase 2 aims. The way a fast track works is that towards the end of your phase 1 period, you will be required to submit a progress report. And in that progress report, you will have to show how you have addressed the quantitative milestones that are necessary in a phase 1 of a fast track application. If the program officer at the National Institute on Aging agrees that you've met those milestones, then you will transition to phase 2. The big advantage there is you would not have to then apply for phase 2 and go through review again and all that. So it can easily save 9 months or more between the phase 1 and the phase 2. So that's how the fast track works. Now, just in the past couple of years, Congress reauthorized us to do what's called direct to phase 2, in which you can come in directly for phase 2 if you've actually done phase 1 type effort using other funds. So in that case, as part of your direct to phase 2 application, you would show the proof of concept data from that you've done, through other funding. So those are the 3 mechanisms. Again, important to note that for this funding opportunity, we expected, some prototype platforms to be available and things of that sort. So we limited it to fast track and to direct to phase 2. But if you're going to apply for the omnibus or the open-ended AD solicitation that I mentioned, the phase 1 is another way you can come in. Now, the applicant assistance program is actually meant for phase 1 applications. So it wouldn't necessarily be relevant if you're going to apply only to this solicitation. Now, again, you can have multiple applications. So if you have a platform type technology and you want to, develop it for caregiver training in this solicitation, but then you also want to come in for the omnibus or the AD solicitation on January 5th for another utility relating to aging, then for that application, you could, in fact, come in through the applicant assistance program. So the web link was sent. There is a webinar for the applicant assistance program coming up very shortly. I'm forgetting the date, but I know it's in the chat, September 15th. So about a week away. I definitely encourage you to attend that webinar if you've not ever received an SBIR before from the NIH. It is a great opportunity to get some coaching, help demystify that process, what really needs to be in that application. That's a great opportunity. For the applicant assistance program, we specifically encourage, companies that are led or owned by underrepresented populations, including both, women, minorities, economically disadvantaged individuals.
Thank you, Todd.
Hopefully that addresses the question. I just want to put it, let me just echo Monique's plug on 2 things. One is our LinkedIn page. We just launched that in the past week. Really excited about it. It's going to be a great way for us to push out content, new funding opportunities, new initiatives, new webinars to our community. We do webinars very regularly. We'll be advertising them there. So I definitely encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn. And also, you know, we're doing these webinars a lot more regularly right now, and it's important for us to learn, are we doing them right? The more value we can provide, so that feedback form is really important. So please click that link for the feedback form for today's webinar and tell us how this can be as optimal as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. And since you're giving tips, another one is before you apply, do reach out to the program officer, and we have put, and we'll do it again, people you can contact. We do like to hear from you and want to help you be successful. So don't be afraid to reach out and ask questions. We are seeing a couple of questions about whether this presentation will be available. We will be sending out the presentation slides very shortly after this presentation. However, we're also going to have a recording of it. It'll take a little bit more time to get that on the website, but we will post it so in a version that is 508 compliant. So the next question comes from folks who are academic researchers, and they want to know whether they can apply. Do they need a small business partner to be able to apply? And how can they maintain their IP rights that they're developing in the lab?
Great. So for this funding opportunity, you would need, the application needs to come from a small business. So you could partner with a small business. And in that case, you know, we would require that you and the small business work out the intellectual property agreements, you know, potential licenses, things of that nature. But yes, for this solicitation, it is required to come from a small business.
Thank you. Todd, are there set-asides for women-owned and economically disadvantaged small businesses?
We do not have set-asides for those populations for the small business programs.
Thank you. And I should note that on the NIA, National Institute on Aging, Small Business Innovation Research page, we do have some resources that are directly targeted for folks from traditionally disadvantaged, underserved small businesses. We also mentioned that the Application Assistance Program is designed to help support and increase diversity in our applications. So we do encourage you to apply.
Exactly. And diversity supplements as well help bring in more diverse populations to existing awards, which is critical.
Thank you. Does the RFA have a focus on educational content only, or is the intent to also accept solutions that can help support and complete a POA and other documents, for example?
I will yield to my colleagues on that.
This is Vijeth. I could just step in. And certainly Todd and Dana certainly welcome your feedback. I would say I think it's an all hands on deck type of approach. You know, one of the slides we looked at, or we shared rather, data from a survey from ARP, wherein an infrequent task was legal management, and that does include POA among other documents. I believe it's, yeah, this slide, this is exactly it.
Tasks that are more infrequent.
So, and I saw another question about whether we can recommend services or tools that are ideal for financial management or legal management. I hesitate on that because I think I don't want to recommend, or you know, as folks that help design this RFA or FOA don't want to recommend certain tools over the others, because I think there are certain best practices that Dana provided and that I provided in terms of devising a piece of technology or product or some type of tool that is effective and that's meaningful to the user and the individual. So beyond just educational platforms, there are opportunities that we tried to highlight both in the FOA at the link and also in this presentation on a couple of slides that I shared in terms of identified family caregiver needs in the realms of financial management and legal management that one could use as roadmaps to then identify a stated area of need from the potential user community that then you can go and construct tools and services around those needs. So I don't know, Dana, if you wanted to supplement what I shared or had any other thoughts.
No, I think you're exactly right, Vijeth, and I appreciate you stating it so clearly. We don't want to be prescriptive about the solution. We want to help the family caregivers. That's the name of the game here. And you presented some very compelling data showing that this is not just a need right now, but it's a need that's going to grow in the future. And so I think what we're looking for are, resourceful, innovative, thoughtful solutions to helping out these family caregivers. Exactly.
I'll just say just one other comment if I'm allowed to. I think it's really that having that need and being able to demonstrate that your solution answers a specific need is going to be very important. And I think a lot of solutions miss the boat, so to speak, by constructing a solution without a need, sort of a solution in search of a question. But I would really start out with the need of the family caregivers, and hopefully we provided some sort of overview for that. And certainly the source, there are links to the sources that resources that we pulled from, among others, right? It's not just AARP or World Health Organization or other organizations, but there's a real wealth of data and information that's growing over the past couple of years, identifying these as real needs and served as the impetus for this collaboration between NIA and ACL for this FOA. So I would start there and start constructing solutions around that. So thanks.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Todd. Would a submission require that the primary researcher partner with an academic research institution?
So if it is a small business applying, there is not a requirement to partner with an academic research institution. It is optional.
Thank you. We're also getting a few questions about what data is needed to be able to successfully apply. So one question that came through is, during the review process, reviewers often want to see power analysis, which may not often be necessary for proof of concept and feasibility. Is there a strategy to help alleviate that so that reviewers are not doing that? Or do you have any feedback for the potential applicant on the type of data they should include?
Yeah, so I'm happy to start, and Dana, as a former SRO, probably has a lot more useful guidance on this one than I do. I think generally, yes, making sure the reviewers have the right expectations is critical. We're actually in the process of optimizing the peer review process for the SBIR program overall at the NIH. But, in terms of concrete things you can do, I think it's really important in your application. Let's say you're doing a fast track, or, let's say it's not through this solicitation and you're doing it through the omnibus, something that accepts a pure phase 1 application, that you be able to explain what you're going to do in phase 2 and why the phase 1 is limited to the study that you're proposing. I think when it's explained to the reviewers in that way, that you are following the budget limits, and this is as much as you could do here, but here is why the types of, let's say, the lack of statistically significant, but the trend will help you then figure out how to do that statistically significant study in phase 2 and why that's helpful. That's the type of thing that you really need to crystallize in your application. Dana, hopefully you can provide a little more guidance here as well.
So my colleague Todd fell into the acronym world, which was, he called me an SRO. I used to be a scientific review officer. And as a scientific review officer, I used to run small business review panels. And so I got to hear over 14 years a lot of feedback from reviewers about what was being proposed. And Todd used a phrase earlier that I think should stick in your mind when it comes to either the fast track application or a direct to phase 2, and that is proof of concept. So a phase 1 study is all about feasibility. It's all about feasibility. Is the concept feasible that you're proposing? And one measure of that is getting input from end users, prospective end users, health professionals, whoever it might be, about the usefulness, the perceived value of this tool that you're proposing to develop. And so I think that the question raised an excellent point about power analysis, and isn't that really more appropriate for phase 2? The answer is yes, but it's incumbent upon you as an applicant to make a case for why whatever you have done so far, talking about the direct to phase 2, whatever work you've done so far, how does that establish the feasibility of the prototype you've developed for then being implemented in the way that you're proposing for phase 2? And so Todd made reference to things like quantitative milestones. What are the milestones that were accomplished that show the feasibility of this technology for accomplishing its end goal? A big mistake that a lot of applicants make is in the context of phase 1, whether it's in a fast track or a standalone phase 1, they do something called a pilot test of the effectiveness of the program. And they get killed on that because there's never a big enough sample size. This goes back to the power point that was raised in the question. So avoid doing any test of effectiveness in phase 1. Phase 1 is not about effectiveness. That's the work of phase 2. Phase 1 is really about feasibility and what data do you have to show that it's feasible. Now, somebody asked a question about would market research count as that? And NIH does not support market research. You don't want to build market research into any plan that you're proposing for funding, but for sure it's worth your while to do some kind of a assessment of what exists out there so that you can convince the reviewers that what you're proposing is innovative and has potential for accomplishing what you want it to accomplish. So I kind of hit a couple of different points there, but phase 1 is all about feasibility. If you're coming in with a direct to phase 2, you want to show that you've done some preliminary work to establish the feasibility of this system that now you're proposing to test for effectiveness in phase 2.
Yeah, and I can add a couple things to the last few comments that Dana mentioned. So in terms of the market research component, so in the phase 1, you can ask, I think it's up to $8,000 for technical assistance. It's not much for phase 1. It's up to $50,000 for phase 2, but that can include market research. The NIH traditionally also has had programs such as an niche assessment program. That's all being kind of redone, but there will be, if you don't ask for the $8,000 in technical assistance in your phase 1, but you do get awarded, there will be NIH programs that help provide some of that technical assistance that could include market research. And the other thing to note is that the commercialization readiness program, which you can apply for once you have a phase 2, does allow for market research, but not in a traditional NIH grant as like an SBIR phase 1 or phase 2, as Dana said. In terms of that last point about, being able to know who your customer are and crystallize that in application, that's really important and really important to include in your commercialization plan. And letters of support from potential end users are really helpful in applications as well.
Thank you both. I recognize we're coming close to time, so I'm just going to note that we will stay on a bit longer because we're seeing some really good questions come through and want to make sure we're being as responsive as possible. But for those who do have to leave, we do want to thank you for joining us, and please do fill out that feedback form and join our communities as we mentioned earlier, and we'll chat those out again. The next question is, how many awards are expected to be made under the solicitation, and what's the time frame from the time that the application is submitted to when a small business may expect to hear back on whether they've been awarded?
So the time frame, I'll handle that one first because I know that off the top of my head. The time frame generally, I believe these will be May council. So an expected award would probably be sometime around July. However, you will receive your score likely in about 3 months post-application. And from that score, we will be able to give you a pretty good idea. For 80+% of the applications, we can give you a pretty good idea from the score if it'll be funded. The last 20% are those ones right around the border where we need to do more diligence on our end, you know, to know if it'll be funded, and those take a little longer. But like I said, for most people, within 3 months, you'll have your score, and we'll be able to give you pretty good guidance on funding likelihood at that point. In terms of the number of awards, I'm trying to remind myself.
Todd, the FOA says 6 awards.
Thank you. Perfect. I was just looking it up. Perfect. Thank you, Dana. So 6 awards are expected. It's a one-time funding opportunity. So, you know, we would be able to go up to, but really it's going to be based on quality, you know, and score and things of that nature.
Thank you. Quick question on clarifying who people need to contact for which funding opportunity. So some folks have asked about the omnibus and who's the appropriate contact, and then who should they contact for this specific funding opportunity announcement.
Thanks. So ND Kearns is really the ideal initial contact for all funding, all SBIR and STTR funding announcements at the NIA. He has tremendous expertise and guidance to give on SBIRs, and thus it is a great first place to go. For this specific opportunity, you know, there may be specific scientific questions that, you know, MD may refer you to Dana or myself, but I would definitely encourage everyone to consider MD as the first point of contact. And Melissa, please chat it out. His email.
Todd, I would just say also, this is Dana, that every funding opportunity announcement, if you look way down to the bottom of the page, it will tell you who the scientific contact is. So for those omnibus solicitations, there'll be a list of people, and there ought to be somebody at the NIA, probably MD Kearns, but they'll be listed at the very bottom of the solicitation, peer review contact, which is for review, and a scientific research contact.
Thank you. Someone is asking whether the ACL or the area agencies on aging might be potential customers for products developed as a result of this funding opportunity announcement. And is there any advantage in engaging the local area agency on aging?
Yeah, this is Vijeth. I'm hesitant to speak on whether AAAs or area agencies on aging are potential clients, but certainly I think it's wise, going back to the market research point, when attempting to test out a solution, help shape or mold or frame a question, or even the solution, or even to identify potential customers, to do as much research as possible. So I see a potential value add. Now, it's not incumbent that you do this to get an award or anything like that, but I see there's an advantage, as is with anything, to do as much homework on folks that are on the ground, that are engaging with family caregivers on a daily basis, that might have a very nuanced understanding of the needs that they're going through, both on a daily, monthly, yearly basis, and then use that information to then inform both the design of the solution, the delivery of the solution, and the analysis, interpretation, and effectiveness of the solution. So certainly there are opportunities there that in the course of doing your market analysis, or even testing out your solution, or even testing whether there's a need, that one could engage with AAAs, these area agencies on aging, and other folks within the aging network, or even aging providers, to then get an understanding of how your solution might quote unquote play in these communities. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question is for Todd. Is it possible to get sample applications that NIA or ACL has funded in the past to help inform developing a successful application for this opportunity?
So for this opportunity, it would really be the NIH SBIR sample applications that would be most relevant. There are certain sample applications at the website for the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases that shows sample applications for SBIR. Unfortunately, I don't think there are any that's kind of directly relevant to these types of platforms. It's actually something that we are actively working on, and I hope within the next couple of months we will have those available, but it will likely be just too late for this funding opportunity. But it is something we realize will be of great value and we are working on.
Thank you, Todd. We received a question about how does someone help decide which study section would be appropriate for what they are proposing? And they are specifically noting work related to dementia patients.
Dana, do you want to?
So yeah, thanks, Todd. So for this particular funding opportunity announcement, there will be a dedicated special emphasis panel, is my understanding of the way this is going to work. So there's no need to shop around for a study section for an application submitted to this specific call. That being said, if you submit an application under any of those omnibus solicitations, then it's probably worth having a conversation with the the peer review contact, but also with the scientific contact. I would say talk with the program officer, scientific contact first. Talk about ideas that you may have about, what kind of a review group would be appropriate. You can also, anybody, because it's a publicly available website, can go to the Center for Scientific Review. So if you do whatever is your favorite search engine and type in a bunch of acronyms, NIH space CSR, Center for Scientific Review, space study sections, well, you could actually do small business, and that search will pull up a listing of the small business study sections, and you can read a description of each one of those. Once you have that elevator pitch, that specific aims page that Todd talked about, it's a really good idea to reach out not only to program staff, but to the scientific review officer and ask that scientific review officer if they think that their study section has appropriate expertise to review that application.
Thank you. And with that, I just want to remind folks to please fill out the feedback form. I recognize that we are at time. However, if you have an additional question, please do reach out to us. We will also do another scan of all the questions we received. And if you have included your name, we'll be able to follow up with you to respond to your question. But I want to thank you for taking the time to learn more about this funding opportunity, as well as this collaboration between ACL and NIA. And I want to thank all of the panelists, Todd, Dana, Vijeth, and also thank you, Brad, for joining us. We hope that you will reach out to us with your questions, that you will feel comfortable and coming to us to help you think through how to successfully apply, and that you join our community, that this is not just a one-time webinar, but that we get to know you better, and you can join our LinkedIn and Twitter network, as well as be a part of our email list and upcoming funding opportunities. Thank you all for joining. And Todd and team, I'll just see if you have any last parting words for our potential applicants.
Thank you. Please share your feedback at bit.ly/31NSXT.
No, thank you. And as I said, any questions, or if you'd like to send your specific games page, or have any questions about kind of how to frame a grant or anything, that can be sent to Dr. MD Kearns at kearns@mail.nih.gov, as was said in the chat. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day and good luck on your applications.
Take care. Thank you to the organizers.